You are standing on a sidewalk with a coffee in your hand when your body suddenly leaves the ground. Not because you jumped, because the earth beneath your feet just stopped moving at over 1,000 miles an hour, and you did not. Buildings around you groan as their foundations twist. Cars slide sideways and crumple into each other. A flock of birds is thrown from the sky, their flight destroyed in an instant. Trees rip from the soil. Along the coast, the ocean rises into a wall of water taller than anything ever recorded. This is not a storm. This is not an earthquake. In this hypothetical, Earth's rotation has stopped completely. In a single second. Nobody on the planet understands what just happened. But every person, every building, every drop of water on the surface is about to feel the same impossible moment. Before going further, let's set the rules of this scenario. Earth's rotation halts instantly, dropping from roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator to 0. Gravity does not change. The planet's mass, its orbit around the sun, and its atmosphere all remain the same. What changes is spin, and everything that depended on it. Under normal conditions, everything on the surface, including you, the air above you, and the oceans, moves together with the planet at the same rotational speed. Momentum is a law of physics, not a suggestion. If the ground beneath a moving object suddenly stops, the object keeps moving. That single fact drives almost everything that follows in this video. This is not primarily a story about magnetic fields or day-night cycles, at least not yet. It's a story about inertia, and what happens when nearly 8 billion people, an entire ocean, and every gust of wind on the planet refuses to stop moving along with the ground. And where you happen to be standing when it happens will decide whether you survive the very first 10 seconds. In the first few seconds, the surface world becomes unrecognizable. At the equator, where rotational speed is highest, anything not firmly anchored is thrown eastward with tremendous force. A person standing outdoors is launched through the air. A driver on the highway keeps moving forward while the road beneath the car has already stopped, tearing tires from their axles. Skyscrapers, built to flex slightly in wind, are hit with a lateral force they were never designed to survive, and many begin cracking near their foundations. At the poles, the effect is almost the opposite. Rotational speed there is close to 0, so the initial jolt barely registers. A person standing in Antarctica might not feel the moment happen at all. This is one of the first strange truths of this scenario. Your location alone decides whether the first 10 seconds are survivable. The atmosphere does not stop with the ground. Air was moving with Earth's spin too, and it keeps moving as a colossal wind, reaching speeds close to the planet's former rotational velocity, several times more powerful than the most destructive hurricane ever recorded. This is not a storm system forming. It's the entire atmosphere sliding across a surface that has suddenly gone still. Forests are flattened for thousands of miles. Airplanes in flight are torn apart or thrown wildly off course. The oceans behave the same way. Water was moving with the spin too, and it does not stop simply because the seafloor did. Enormous walls of water driven by leftover momentum surge across coastlines. This would not resemble a normal tsunami. It would resemble an entire ocean trying to keep spinning while the planet underneath it has already stopped moving. Within minutes, coastal cities near the equator face flooding, collapsing structures, and hurricane-force wind all at once. Now expand the view from individuals to entire systems across the first day. Communication networks, where they still stand, are overwhelmed instantly. In many equatorial regions, emergency services are gone within the first hour, their vehicles and stations destroyed before any response could even begin. Hospitals still standing face 2 disasters at once, a wave of catastrophic injuries from the initial jolt, and a growing wave of injuries from the ongoing hurricane force winds outside. Governments near the poles, largely spared the worst of the initial destruction, are the first to attempt any organized response. But they immediately face a new problem. The old day-night cycle no longer works the way it once did. Without rotation, A single point on Earth's surface no longer cycles quickly between day and night. Whichever direction the sun currently faces will stay lit for a very long stretch, while the opposite side stays dark for just as long. Regions facing away from the sun when rotation stopped are now heading into an extended night, far longer than any night in human history, and temperatures there begin falling fast. Food and water systems fracture next. Farmland along the equator, already devastated by wind, is now caught in either endless daylight or endless darkness, depending on where the sun happened to sit when everything froze in place. Crops exposed to nonstop sun begin to scorch within days. Crops trapped in prolonged darkness simply stop growing. Regions that were once self-sufficient in food are forced into rationing almost immediately. The instinct for most people is to head underground, away from the wind, and wait for conditions to calm down. At first, this seems like the obvious solution. It isn't, not entirely. Below ground, people are safe from the wind. But they are not safe from what comes next. A planet whose surface temperature is beginning to split violently in two opposite directions at once. As the first week unfolds, clear patterns begin to emerge. Coastal cities near the equator are largely gone, wiped out by the combined force of wind and flooding. Mountainous inland regions, and especially areas closer to the poles, fare far better, since both wind speed and flood risk were tied directly to rotational speed, which was near zero there to begin with. Survivors begin migrating away from the equator in both directions, toward the twilight zones, the narrow bands of Earth's surface caught between the permanently lit side and the permanently dark side, where temperatures remain closer to livable. Something unexpected becomes valuable almost overnight, reliable knowledge of exactly where the sun currently sits relative to the ground. Without a rotating Earth, the sun's fixed position in the sky becomes the single most important survival variable there is, more valuable in the short term than food stockpiles, because it tells people whether they are walking toward endless day or endless night. Meanwhile, in orbit, satellites face their own crisis. Satellites in geostationary orbit had matched Earth's spin exactly, appearing to hover motionless over one fixed point on the ground below. With the planet no longer rotating beneath them, that relationship breaks down completely, and the communication and navigation systems that depended on it begin failing over the following days, adding a second collapse layered directly on top of the first. At first, moving toward the twilight zones seems like the obvious solution, a safe middle ground between two extremes. But after several days, the same strategy creates a completely different problem. Millions of people are converging on the same narrow strips of livable land at once, land that was never built to hold that many people, with limited food, limited shelter, and limited fresh water to support them. What looked like salvation from a distance turns into its own kind of crisis up close, one of crowding and scarcity rather than heat or wind. But here's the part almost nobody would expect at first. The most lasting danger from a stopped Earth is not the wind, and it is not the flooding. It's temperature. Without fast rotation cycling every region quickly between sunlight and shadow, the side of Earth facing the sun begins heating for an extended, uninterrupted stretch of time, while the side facing away begins cooling for just as long, with nothing to reset the balance. Deserts on the daylight side could become lethally hot within weeks. Regions on the night side would begin dropping toward temperatures no modern city was ever built to survive. This single consequence, a slow divergence in temperature rather than sudden destruction, ultimately decides who lives through the following months. Scientists studying the situation from surviving observatories confirm something that changes everything. Earth's magnetic field is generated largely by the motion of molten material deep inside its core, motion that is closely tied to the planet's rotation. A sudden stop at the surface would not instantly stop the core's motion, since the core behaves as a separate, semi-independent system, based on what we know about how the field is generated. That mismatch would be expected to weaken and destabilize the magnetic field over time, though scientists would still be working out exactly how fast. That field is the planet's main shield against solar radiation. As it destabilizes, more radiation reaches the surface, and the auroras, normally confined near the poles, begin appearing at far lower latitudes, a strange, beautiful warning sign of a planet-wide system quietly failing. As the weeks pass, the crisis stops being about survival alone and starts reshaping society itself. Because the equatorial band is unlivable and the twilight zones are overcrowded, entire economies collapse and reform almost overnight. Old industries built around equatorial manufacturing and shipping routes vanish, because the ports and factories along them no longer exist. New industries appear almost as fast, built around two suddenly precious resources, sunlight on one side of the planet and geothermal or wind energy on the other. Because food production has shifted almost entirely to covered or underground facilities, farming stops being a rural profession and becomes a highly technical, urban one. That creates a new kind of labor shortage, forcing governments to retrain millions of displaced workers into food production almost overnight. Education adapts alongside it. Schools built around a fixed daily schedule of morning, afternoon, and night no longer make sense in a world with no reliable day-night cycle, so learning shifts toward flexible, shift-based systems built around work rather than the clock. Relationships and family life change too. With so many people forced to migrate away from destroyed equatorial homelands, extended families are frequently separated across the twilight zones, and communities begin reorganizing around shared shelters rather than traditional neighborhoods. Crime rises sharply in the first months, driven by scarcity of food, water, and safe land, but it begins falling again as new local governments form around these shelters and establish basic rationing systems. Culture shifts as well. Because the sun no longer rises and sets the way it once did, entire calendars built around days, weeks, and years become unreliable. And new systems of timekeeping emerge based on artificial clocks rather than the sky. Cities themselves begin to change shape, curving along the twilight line instead of spreading outward the way older cities once did. Because livable land is no longer a wide plain. It's a narrow, valuable ribbon wrapped around the planet. Because that ribbon of livable land is so narrow, and so many people are trying to live inside it, governments face a pressure they were never designed for, managing a civilization that has been physically compressed into a fraction of its former footprint. And this is where the situation moves from a regional catastrophe to a true civilization-level turning point. Faced with a planet that can no longer support life spread evenly across its surface, the surviving nations of the world are forced into a decision none of them ever expected to make, cooperating not out of goodwill, but out of pure necessity. Because no single country controls an entire twilight zone, and because food, energy, and shelter now depend on resources split unevenly between the sunlit and dark sides of the planet, isolated nations simply cannot survive alone anymore. Old borders and old rivalries begin dissolving, not because of diplomacy, but because a country with abundant solar energy and no farmland needs a neighbor with underground farms and no power. And neither one can bargain from strength. What emerges over the following months is less a collection of nations and more a network of interdependent zones, each trading the one resource it has in surplus for the one it lacks. This is the moment the story shifts from individual survival to something larger, a species reorganizing its entire way of living around the fixed position of the sun. Engineers begin designing settlements meant to slowly follow the twilight line as it very gradually shifts, essentially building movable, adaptable communities instead of permanent, fixed ones. It is not a clean or peaceful transition. Resource conflicts still happen, and entire regions still struggle to adapt in time. But for the first time since the planet stopped turning, humanity is no longer simply reacting to the disaster. It has started building something intended to last. 1 year later, the world looks nothing like it did before. The equatorial band, once home to a significant share of humanity, is largely uninhabited, caught permanently between extreme heat and wind-blown ruin. Human settlement has concentrated into two crescent-shaped regions, the twilight zones on either side of the planet, where the sun sits low in the sky and temperatures remain survivable. Farming has moved almost entirely into enormous covered or underground facilities, since traditional agriculture can no longer rely on a predictable day-night cycle. Energy generation has shifted heavily toward solar power on the permanently lit side, and toward geothermal and wind power on the permanently dark side, since each region now has one resource in constant surplus and one in constant shortage. Governments that survived have reorganized almost entirely around a single question: which side of the Terminator line does your territory sit on? National borders matter less now than proximity to livable temperature. And new alliances have formed, not around old political history, but around shared exposure to sunlight, or the lack of it. Daily life has changed in quieter ways too. People no longer speak of morning or evening, since neither one arrives the way it once did. Clocks and calendars are now entirely artificial constructs, agreed upon rather than observed in the sky. Children born after the event grow up never having experienced a sunrise, and for them, a spinning Earth is not a memory. It is simply a story their parents tell them about a very different world, one that sounds almost impossible to a generation that has only ever known fixed light and fixed shadow. Looking further ahead, 10 to 100 years out, this becomes a story of long-term adaptation rather than sudden disaster. A reasonable consequence, based on what we understand of orbital mechanics, is that a stationary Earth would not stay perfectly stationary forever. Gravitational interactions with the Moon and Sun would likely begin very slowly reintroducing some rotation over an extremely long timescale, though the exact rate of that change moves well into speculation. Human architecture, agriculture, and even culture would likely reorganize permanently around a fixed sun, in much the same way older civilizations once organized their lives around a rotating one. Cities on the daylight side might build largely underground to escape sustained heat, essentially becoming subterranean societies lit entirely by artificial means. Cities on the dark side might develop advanced lighting systems capable of manufacturing their own daytime, recreating the rhythm of a sunrise that no longer exists in nature. Whether biological evolution itself would respond to this new environment over such a timescale remains firmly speculative. Human technology, however, almost certainly would. Engineers of later generations might design mobile cities capable of physically tracking the slowly shifting twilight line, allowing entire populations to migrate gradually rather than face the sudden collapse the first generation experienced. Over enough centuries, humanity might come to see a spinning planet not as the natural order of things, but as a distant, almost unbelievable memory. This would be a species defined less by the disaster itself and more by the decades of careful engineering it took to make an unstable world livable again. The final, most important realization is this: Earth's spin is not a small background detail of daily life. It is the invisible engine behind nearly everything people take for granted: consistent day and night, breathable speed winds, stable oceans, a functioning magnetic shield, and a livable temperature spread evenly across the globe. Remove that one rotating motion, and it is not one system that fails. It is nearly every system at once, each one connected to the last through simple, logical cause and effect. The wind was never separate from the rotation. The oceans were never separate from it. Even the magnetic field protecting the entire planet from the sun was, in part, a product of that same spin. What began as a single, impossible second, the moment the ground beneath your feet stopped moving, unravels into a chain reaction spanning weather, food, energy, government, and culture, until an entire civilization is left rebuilding itself around a sun that no longer moves across the sky. And perhaps the strangest part of all is how quiet that motion always was. Nobody ever felt Earth spinning while it happened. It was silent, constant, and completely invisible, right up until the one moment it stopped. And everything it had been quietly holding together for billions of years came undone at once. So picture that world one more time. A planet split permanently between fire and frost, with a thin, fragile strip of habitable land caught in between, and a species forced to rebuild its entire civilization around the position of a sun that no longer moves. Everything you experience each day, sunrise, sunset, a cool breeze, a stable coastline, exists only because Earth never stops turning. Would you have known how much depended on that single, silent motion? We spend our entire lives standing on a spinning planet without ever noticing it, trusting a system we never chose and rarely think about at all. And if the spinning ever truly did stop, do you think humanity would find a way to survive on that fragile strip of land in between? Or would it be the beginning of the end?